just want to illustrate a point with you. A lot of times, I mentioned I've seen students that try to use a very thin brush like this for a lot of parts of watercolor. And certainly a brush like this is very nice if you're going to go in, and I'm just taking a little bit of black on my brush, and I'm just going to go in and maybe do a little outline work. So it's certainly good for something like that. But one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to try to come over here to a wall and paint a wall only using a thin brush. You certainly can do it if you're going to be kind of wild. You know, move around a lot. But if you just come in and try to paint little bits, you know, it's going to take a very, very long time to do an entire painting. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue working on these walls. Now, one of the things, well, again, I guess I'm kind of showing that if you really want to, you certainly can use a small brush like this, but don't be afraid to move the pigment around. Don't try to simply come in and only do small little strokes like you're working with pen and ink or something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get a little bit of water in here. All right, let me go back to the brush I am enjoying using. Typically speaking, we're going to see some really nice exterior lighting effects coming in onto the walls, and any wall that is opposite a window will be a little bit darker. So the walls that are adjacent but facing away from the window will be a little bit darker. So let me go in with some of my yellow ochre, some of my burnt umber brown, and then I'm going to add just a little bit of violet with that, and a touch of black. And then what I'm going to do is, I've already got this damp, so we'll be doing the wet paper techniques here. Okay, want a little more of my yellow ochre in that so we really see the wall color. There we go, look at that. And then I want to take a little bit of dry brush, kind of move this around. So my brush is now just a little bit damp. Get a little more black, mix with my brown, kind of put it up here at the top, and then same thing down here at the bottom. And now there is a baseboard down here, so don't cover baseboard. Get a little more black, a little bit of violet, and a little bit of our base color. Really kind of move that around. All right, and we're going to let that dry for a second, and then we'll come in and refine it. Because what I want to do is I actually want this area to be darker, but I need to let, I mean, I could keep going in and adding black, and that would blend a little bit, but I don't want it to become too muddy. So I just want to let it sit for a second, and then we'll come in and go from there. Now, while this is sitting, I'm going to go ahead and come over to this column. Now in this column we're going to keep the paper dry again, and we'll go ahead and just start with, just kind of do this in a couple of layers here. I'm going to start with black and a little bit of our base color, and we'll start right up here at the top. Now if I was using marker, I would be putting probably a dark gray marker effect in here like this. Oops. See, this is again where watercolor can be forgiving. Just take a little bit of water on a rag and you can get rid of any kind of blotches. So watch your hand whenever you're working with wet areas. One thing you can do, a lot of artists do this, is they'll use another brush and rest their hand on a brush while they're painting, and that gives them a little better balance with the paintbrush, a little better control. Alright, so I want to add a little more of my yellow ochre in there. So get a little more of the yellow ochre. And now I'm going to just get a little bit of water on my brush and wash this. So again, as the watercolor pigment settles within that water base, it's going to move around a little bit. Okay, so there again, if we could wet the paper and apply pigment, or we could apply pigment to the dry paper, as we did it here, and then apply a little bit of water over and let it bleed. The wet paper is a little more traditional method. The dry paper is a method that I typically like to use, mainly because I learned how to illustrate using marker before I ever tried watercolor, and I do like the sharp edges and the sharp lines that you can gain. Alright. Okay, so now we're going to let these two pieces dry for a little bit, and as they dry I'll go ahead and do this one. This one I'll do the same way as I did this. I'm just going to take a little bit of water, some of my base pigment mixed with a little bit of black, a little bit of violet. I'm going to do a stroke right down this edge. And a little more black, a little bit of violet. And again, back in with a little bit of my yellow ochre. Now, this is a piece that's in the foreground. So we're just going to let that bleed off the page a little bit. We're not going to be too concerned about perfection. And then if we want to keep making it darker, again, we could just apply a little bit more black up here at the top. And again, I keep mixing black with my base pigment, which is the yellow ochre, and a little bit of burnt umber to get a tan effect. All right. Okay, so now we're going to let that dry for a second, and as that dries, then we'll come back and we'll work on the ceiling and this wall. What I'm going to do here is go ahead and add a little bit of black up at the top. Bring a little bit of black down this wall, a little bit behind the table. Not going to be too concerned about perfection there. Take a little bit of dark value, pull alongside of these pieces of art. Again, not going to be too concerned about perfection. And then what I'm going to do, this is a slightly different method, so I just put down some black. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to grab a, we're going to make a new color, and this color is going to be a version of the color we were using on the other wall. So again, we'll be using burnt umber, we'll be using burnt umber, yellow ochre, and then we'll also be using a little bit of yellow. Now I've got this on a brush with quite a bit of water, and I'm just going to draw it across this wall. And I'm going to draw it down the wall. And now I'm just going to add more water and blend this color around a little bit. Now I'm not done yet. Blend this around a little bit. Now what I want to do is make sure I get color everywhere where it needs to be color. Again, this is a little bit in the foreground, so we're just going to let that meld a little. I'm going to go in with a dry paper towel and pick up a little bit of the color to create a little bit of a stucco effect. So again, it's pulling up a little bit of color, and then as I'm pressing down, it's applying a little bit as well. All right, and it still left some nice dark areas where the exterior lighting would not be showing, and then lightened some areas that would be getting some natural light as well as some ambient incandescent light. Now, if we're not exactly happy with this color, what we can do is you can always do a light wash. Let's say we want to do a little more of the yellow ochre with a little bit of yellow. Just going to add some water to that. So as this dries, we could just do another little wash over top. And you can change the color of the wall while still maintaining shading and shadow effects. And then again, we could dab a little bit with a paper towel, and you can create a slight stucco effect. Now, as we're waiting for this to dry, notice how the water has become quite filthy. Highly recommend that after a few different walls, you go ahead and replace your water and clean your palette again, just to make sure that you're ready to go with the next set of colors. Now that our walls are drying, and they're relatively dry, not picking up any more pigment, or not much loose pigment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a chiseled brush. And you can certainly use a chiseled brush or, again, a fine tip brush. And I want to create a sharper line along these edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to, again, I'm going to take the colors I've been working with, which are a burnt umber mixed with a little bit of yellow ochre. Okay. And then I'm going to take just a little bit of black mixed with that, get a dark version. My brush is relatively dry. I want mostly pigment, very little water. And then I am going to actually set a paper towel down so I can do this cleanly. And I'm just going to start up here at the top. Try to let the paint bead up on the tip of the brush. And just refine that line. It's not going to be as perfect as if I were using a straight edge and a marker, but it will have a nice effect. So I need a little bit more water. Get some pigment there. I'm going to get a little more black. I'm going to come over to this side. Now on this one we got pretty close to a sharp edge, but let's just kind of refine that edge a little bit. Okay, so that's one way you can just refine your edges. Again, you know, some people try to put masking tape along here, or actually drafting tape or painter's tape. That can have a tendency to pull up your paper. It also, if you don't get the edge burnished down enough, it'll bleed. And keep in mind that as you're doing an illustration like this, you can always offer it to a client, you know, as a present, have it framed. You know, you can consider this a piece of art once you've completed it. You know, if you really put some time and effort into working with the drawing. I'm just going to go in and add some more shadows and shading while we're working on this. All right, so I like what's happening in here. Got a little different color happening, and I'm okay with that. Mainly because, you know, we have natural light coming in, we have reflected light within the space from the furniture, from this other wall, so it's okay. If you want colors to be exact, if you want the colors to be an exact match, you can always go in and just kind of, keep working with it. I'll just kind of add a few darker strokes here, just to kind of mix it a little. And again, when you have a lot of visual movement, it keeps the eye active and moving around the illustration. All right. Okay, so now the next step, what we're going to do is I am going to use a thinner brush. You could do it with obviously the wider brush that we've been doing everything else with, but I'm going to work up here on the ceiling for a bit, and I'm going to do the same kind of effects that I did everywhere else. On this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep maybe a lighter version of this wall. Obviously, you want to have your colors chosen before you start painting. So we're going to do a very light version of this color. And to do a light version, I'm not adding white, I'm just going to add more water. Now, we'll go ahead and do this part of the ceiling. And this part of the ceiling can be relatively uniform. Just going to take a little bit more water. Now, don't be afraid to move around. If you have trouble painting in a straight line, you can get up, you can move around your table. I'm going to come back in here and make this darker, but I want to go ahead and get the base color on before I do that this time. Alright, again, putting down some color and then adding a little bit of water to it helps that color move around, and that movement gives kind of a modeling of color. And that modeling of color creates a little more visual interest for the eye. Alright, so now that we have the base color for this part of the ceiling, I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of black, take a little bit of violet, and then take a little bit of my brown colors that I've been working with, a little bit of water, and what I want to do is create a darker area towards the window. Now that's going on pretty dark. I just want to dab on a little bit of color. And again, watercolor, forgiving media. I'm going to go back in, I'm going to pull some of this in a second. Just want to get kind of a straight line across the top of my window frame. And let's see, do a little bit of motion. Okay, now I'm going to clean the brush and then go back in and pull a little bit of that pigment. And as I pull a little bit of that pigment, I could spread it around in some other areas that would have some value changes as well. So, pull a little pigment, wipe it on a paper towel, or pull a little pigment and spread it around to some other areas that could use a little bit of shading. Now I'm getting a little bit of black from the top of my other wall. I'm going to move it around a little bit. and that was an area I wanted to look a little bit like stucco. Go back in and touch that up. Okay, so now we're going to have to let this dry for a moment. Just going to do this is just a wet brush, just doing a little wash to kind of help things blend. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do this top piece while everything else is drying, mainly because we're using the same colors. So I'm going to go ahead and go in with the darker value like I did before. Do a little curve effect on ceilings. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of my base browns, really water them down, a lot of water. Put a little bit of yellow on this one, and then we'll come up and we'll just do a wash. And again, if you feel like you have a little too much pigment, you can always take a paper towel, absorb some. If you want it to blend a little more, just get a little bit of water on your brush and go in and scrub it around. There's no one way to do this. The main thing is to think about the colors that you're using in the space. Try to bring some of the colors up into other areas. So in this case, you know, part of the reason for a little bit of that violet, it kind of brings a little bit of this red up into the ceiling, and it helps tie everything together. Even though we know this is really gray or maybe a light tan, it still ties it all together. And then again, just like we did with this wall, if you really want to make these a color, and let's say this is again maybe a very, very light tan color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some yellow with my yellow ochre, put a lot of water with it, and do a wash. Okay, and then all of a sudden we have a nice color pigment without being overpowering, without being too solid. All right, so we're going to keep working this. All right, and there we have, again, a very good start. We do have to let this dry for a little bit. So as we're going to let this, as we're letting the ceiling dry before we can do the soffit area, what I want to do is go ahead and work on these pillows. Okay, so now that we have most of this completed, we want to go ahead and start working on the pillows, and then from there move on to some other pieces. For these pillows, since we're working with so many tans and browns in the room along with this red, and then there'll be just a solid color carpet. We'll probably just do a white carpet and maybe a wood floor here. Let's just add a little bit of tan into these pillows. Now I want to do this one, again, there's no one way to do this. So for this one, what I want to do, I take some of our color we've been using for the wall, and I'm going to use it on the pillows. All right, so if that is a color that works, go ahead and do both pillows with it. All right, don't be too afraid of leaving some little bit of white space here and there. Now, with this tan color, we could see you can get a lot of different values in here, but we're going to be more exacting with these pillows. So what we'll do is we'll come over here on the edge with a little bit of black mixed with our brown, and we'll just kind of dab it. And we'll do that again. Mix a little bit of black with our brown, and this time I'm going to just a touch of violet. Just kind of dab some color in there, let it bleed. You know, now since this is wet from the yellow, this is just going to bleed a little bit. Do the same thing here. This is my black with a little bit of violet. I want to try to get some effects of some folds on the fabric. And then of course some shading on the edges. And you can keep working while it's wet if you really are brave and you want to get a little darker. Go ahead. Put it on while it's wet and it'll absorb a little bit into the moisture of the paper. If you feel like you have a little too much, you can of course clean your brush, dry your brush, and then you could go back in and you could pick up a little bit of the color or a little bit of the pigment or value. Now what I'm going to do is just let's smooth that out just a little, just by adding a little bit of water. And that looks pretty good. I'll just kind of smooth out that bottom part. Okay, so there are the pillows, and we're just going to let those sit and dry for a little bit. And while the pillows are drying, what we'll do is go ahead and start work on the floor. And like I said, we'll just kind of make this a white carpet. Alright, for the white carpet, what we want to do is nothing is ever truly white. So we're going to do some darker values right over here behind the piece and underneath the piece. And I'm going to go ahead and use a wet brush with, again, a little bit of my violet and black mixture. And then I'm going to go ahead and add just a touch of the brown that we've been using throughout, so I keep my shading a little bit consistent. Do some dark lines first under the piece of furniture. Let's say there's a little bit of light coming in from the windows, maybe a little reflected light back here, so we'll get a little bit of shading, definitely shading underneath the piece, into the room. Same thing here, a little bit of shading from the legs, shading underneath the piece. Let me get a little more pigment. Okay, same thing over here. Maybe we see a little bit of light coming through there, and a little bit of shadow and shading underneath the piece. Kind of pull that over. Since this is a carpet, we can go ahead and get a little bit of shading on that edge, and maybe a little bit of shading on this edge. Now that we've got just a touch of shading going around this carpet, what I want to do is just take some water. Clean my brush, dab it off, and then just touch the brush into water so there's a little bit of water on the brush. And then I'm going to bring that water over my lines and just kind of let them bleed out into the carpet a little bit. Not everywhere, just in a few spots. Because again, if you ever really look at something that's white, very little of the object is technically white. Now again, I have this tendency, because I learned how to illustrate using markers first, I have a tendency to do some strokes like I might do with marker. But with watercolor, I could always go in and soften those strokes. Okay. So now we have a little bit of the colors from the room mixed into our shaded areas for this white carpet. And if you don't think the carpet is white enough, again, you could always pick up a little pigment here and there. Okay. And then when everything is done with the watercolor, what we can also do is go in and we could scrub in a little bit of white. We'll do that with, we're going to add a little more highlight into some of these areas, and we could add a little white to the carpet as well and kind of do some stipple effects. But again, we have to wait for that to dry now. Now that the carpet's dry, now that the walls are dry, what we're going to do is go ahead and do this the soffit area. Again, back to my same color palette, same pigment I've been using, black mixed with a little bit of violet, mixed with a little bit of burnt umber and a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to shade this area. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to make this area a little darker, because again it's right above the window, so it's really not getting any reflected light from the outside. Get a little more black. All right. Now let me go back and add a little bit of the base colors I've been using. A little bit of yellow mixed with a little bit of yellow ochre, and then really water that down. I'm going to have a little bit of my black and violet mixture in there with it. And I'm going to drag it across just to kind of give a little bit of color. Okay, there you have it. What we're going to do is just kind of leave this again, let it dry. Oops. Let's get a little more blending in there. Some of the water was settling, so I want it to blend a little bit. We're going to let that dry for a bit.